The fluorescent lights of Mercy General hum their eternal drone as Laura Bennett moves through the ICU with practiced invisibility, her fingers steady as she adjusts a cardiac monitor at 6:41 a.m. 12 years. 12 years of arriving before dawn, of taking the shifts nobody wanted, of existing in the spaces between other people's attention. The antiseptic smell mingles with California sunshine struggling through sealed windows as she checks vitals on room for 12, an 83-year-old post-op, stable, no surprises. Her scrubs are navy blue, wrinkled from the night shift she'd picked up again. Her badge reads L. Bennett, RN, with no title, no decorations. That's how she likes it. Dr. Sterling sweeps into the unit at 7:15 a.m. like he owns the air itself, his white coat tailored, his stethoscope draped with the casual arrogance of someone who's never questioned his right to be noticed. He's 48, perpetually tanned, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and ice that move through the staff like a man scanning a buffet for the lowest quality protein. He rounds on the post-op patients with his residents trailing like remoras, narrating his observations in the voice of someone filming a documentary about his own competence. Laura continues charting at the nurse's station, her pen moving in her careful, precise script. She doesn't look up. She knows he's coming. Bennett, he says, and her name lands like something unpleasant discovered on the sole of his shoe. You adjusted the metoprolol on room for 12 without an order. Laura sets her pen down with the deliberation of someone placing a loaded weapon on a table. She turns to face him. The patient's heart rate was 118 when you rounded yesterday. I called cardiology at 0600. Dr. Patel approved the increase. Sterling's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. He wasn't expecting documentation. He glances at his residents, a teaching moment, an opportunity to establish dominance, and then back to Laura with the expression of a man adjusting his strategy in real time. Some nurses, he says, loud enough that everyone within 30 feet stops moving, think longevity equals competence. 23 years on a unit is nothing to do with the ability to make clinical decisions. He pauses, lets the insult settle like sediment. You called cardiology. You didn't wait for an order. You made an assumption about a patient that wasn't yours. The room goes dead silent. The heart monitor in 412 continues its rhythmic beep, steady, stable, exactly where it should be because of the medication Laura had advocated for. She doesn't blink. She doesn't argue. She reaches for her pen and returns to her charting as if he's already left the room. This is the choreography they've developed over the past 3 years, his escalating contempt, her radical, infuriating composure. Her hands don't shake. Her voice doesn't crack. She simply continues working, which somehow makes his rage feel smaller. Sterling stands there for exactly 4 seconds, she counts them by the monitor's beeps, and then walks away, his residents scurrying behind him like ducklings. Laura doesn't look up until she hears his voice in the next room, already lecturing about something else, already performing for his audience. She has worked in this hospital for 12 years, and in those 12 years she has learned how to be a ghost. It's not that hard, really. You show up. You do the work. You never make the mistake of being right in a way that makes someone else look foolish. You keep your head down and you touch the small patch of faded cloth sewn inside your jacket lining every morning before you start your shift, the 75th Ranger Regiment patch, worn soft as prayer cloth, and you remember that you promised Tom, your late husband, that you would keep your head down. That you would stay invisible. That you would never let anyone look too closely at your hands. At 1:38 p.m., the elevator at the end of the ICU corridor opens and a wheelchair rolls out. The orderly pushing it is a young man, maybe 19, struggling slightly with the weight. The patient in the chair is broad-shouldered despite the paralysis, with the kind of spine that comes from command bearing, the straight-backed posture that 23 years of military discipline etches into muscle memory. Laura is updating the whiteboard with vitals when she sees him, and her pen stops mid-word. Commander James Reeves. His face is thinner than it was 6 months ago when Michael had video-called from his forward operating base and the camera had panned briefly to show his CO in the background, approving something, barking orders in that voice that carried authority like other men carry oxygen. Reeves had taken a 7-ton truck off a mountain road near Sanjin Valley in Helmand Province, and the Taliban hasn't taken credit for it, which means it was probably just bad luck and worse timing. Her son had sent her a message 48 hours later, company stable. Medevac. Spinal. They are flying him stateside for surgery. The message had arrived at 3:17 a.m. and she had stared at it until the screen went dark. Now he's here. At Mercy General. In room for 18. Laura finishes writing the number and sets her pen down with the precision of someone placing a detonator. She doesn't approach the wheelchair. She watches from the nurse's station as his family arrives, a woman who must be his wife, 2 adult children, a man in a cardigan who looks like a brother. They crowd around him, touching his shoulders, asking questions, their voices climbing over each other in that specific pitch of people trying to sound normal while terrified. Reeves' face is impassive. The kind of impassive that comes from training. From holding 17 Marines in a kill zone while waiting for extraction. From understanding that your composure is the only thing keeping the people around you from fracturing. She recognizes it because she sees it in her own bathroom mirror every morning. Laura busies herself with the med cart, checking the stock of 500 milliliter saline bags, verifying the automated dispenser, making herself useful and invisible in that particular way she's perfected. She's wearing her jacket over her scrubs. It's 67 degrees outside and the hospital keeps the ICU cold enough to preserve cadavers, and inside the lining of that jacket, close to her ribs, is the patch. She can feel it even though no one else could possibly see it. A small square of faded navy blue with a gold Ranger tab, worn threadbare at the edges from being touched. From being remembered. From being the last thing she holds onto when the weight of invisibility starts to suffocate her. The internal doors to room for 18 open at 2:34 p.m. and Dr. Sterling sweeps in with his residents following like pilot fish. Laura is precisely 9 feet away, replacing the code cart's defib pads, when she hears Reeves' wife say, his medications, the narcotic was working better yesterday, and the swelling in his legs started going down when Laura increased his compression stockings to sequential. I'll handle the medications, Sterling says, and the temperature in the hallway seems to drop. The compression stockings are fine as they are. Laura doesn't turn around. She clicks the defibrillator pad package shut and begins counting the emergency airway supplies in their plastic tray. 2 7.0 endotracheal tubes. 2 8.0. 3 8.5. The inventory changes every shift but the ritual is the same. Count. Document. Know what you have. Know what you'll need before the moment arrives. But the narcotic dosing, Reeves' wife continues, and Laura can hear the strain in her voice, the particular desperation of someone trying to advocate for a patient while understanding they're not actually qualified to have an opinion. He was sleeping better. Some nurses, Sterling says, and Laura's hand still for exactly 1 second over the airway tray, think longevity on a unit means they understand pharmacology. The medication protocol hasn't changed. The patient is receiving appropriate care. Laura closes the emergency airway drawer. She can see Reeves' face reflected in the polished metal of the medication cart. His jaw is tight. He's not looking at his wife. He's looking at something past all of them, the way a man looks when he's making calculations about survival. She recognizes that expression too. She's worn it. She turns and walks past room for 18 without making eye contact. Not because she's afraid. Not because she's uncertain. But because she understood in the moment the elevator doors opened that this man, her son's commanding officer, a warrior trained the same way she was trained, scarred in ways that don't show up on X-rays, is about to become the new focal point of Dr. Sterling's contempt. And if Sterling notices her watching Reeves too closely, if he catches even a flicker of recognition in her eyes, he will use that. He will weaponize it. He will orchestrate some beautiful, methodical destruction that will take months to unfold and will end with one of them destroyed. She has learned, over 12 years, to protect people by pretending not to see them. The afternoon shift continues. Laura administers medications on schedule, monitors vitals, adjusts force with hands that move like they're operating under 30-second response protocols, even though the most dangerous thing in this hospital is someone's ego. She hears Sterling in room for 18 at 4:17 p.m., his voice carrying clearly through the open door as he addresses Reeves' family. Your husband is receiving the standard of care. If you're not comfortable with my treatment plan, there are other hospitals. It's a threat wrapped in professional language. It's territorial marking. It's the sound of a man establishing dominance over people who can't fight back. Reeves doesn't respond. He just stares at something on the wall that no one else can see, and Laura understands with absolute clarity that whatever happens next, it will have started in this moment. In this room. In the presence of a commander who recognizes authority when he sees it, and a doctor who will do anything to convince himself he's the only one in the room who matters. At 4:52 p.m., Laura's phone buzzes against her hip, the text from an unknown number. She doesn't check it. She already knows what she'll find if she looks. Michael, sending word. Michael, who inherited her capacity for silence and her father's capacity for standing his ground. Michael, who's currently 7,486 miles away in Helmand Province and will never know that his commanding officer has just been admitted to the same hospital where his mother works, and will definitely, absolutely not remember that his mother was anything other than a woman named Laura who bakes lasagna and asks about his safety in careful, measured text messages. She finishes her medication rounds at 6:12 p.m. and clocks out without incident. The evening shift takes over. Sterling is gone, presumably back to whatever corner office he's cultivated with research grants and strategic alliances and the particular brand of charisma that makes people want to believe in him until they don't. The hospital continues its quiet work of keeping people alive, the machines humming, the monitors beeping, the nurses moving through hallways like people trained for a war nobody talks about. Laura walks out to the parking lot as the sun touches the horizon and turns the sky the color of old copper. She touches the patch inside her jacket lining, the one that smells like another lifetime, and she thinks about a man in a wheelchair who knows how to wait because waiting is what soldiers do when everything else has been taken from them. She has no way of knowing that everything is about to change. That in 3 days, Sterling will file complaints and make phone calls and begin the careful construction of her destruction. That in 5 days, Reeves' chest tube will dislodge during a routine transfer and she will perform a procedure that will end his career trajectory. That the Pentagon, the actual Pentagon, the one she'd spent 12 years trying to forget exists, will call her on an encrypted line and ask her if she's ready to stop being invisible. For now, she just drives home through San Diego traffic, and she touches the patch, and she remembers what it felt like to be someone. The break room at Mercy General on a Tuesday morning smelled like burnt coffee and institutional desperation. Laura pushed through the double doors at 0645, 12 years of invisibility settled into her shoulders like a second skin, and found the performance improvement plan taped to the bulletin board beside the vending machine. Her name in bold. Bennett, L. Multiple deficiencies. The header was formatted like a scarlet letter. She didn't stop walking. She didn't let her eyes linger. The mask stayed intact, the tired nurse, the competent technician, the woman who'd learned long ago that survival meant becoming furniture in other people's spaces. But her fingers brushed the patch sewn inside her jacket lining, felt the weight of embroidered unit insignia through 2 layers of cotton, and something in her chest went very still. Sterling had moved fast. 3 days. That's all it took from Reeves' admission to full institutional warfare. Laura had spent those 3 days in a particular kind of hell reserved for people caught between 2 identities. She'd watched Reeves from the doorway of his ICU room while Sterling held court with his family, listened to the commander try not to stare at her hands, observed the way his eyes tracked her movements with the intensity of someone conducting intelligence analysis. She'd been careful. Professional. The model of detached competence, the kind of nurse who checked vitals without looking at faces, who changed dressings without making eye contact, who spoke in the measured monotone of someone reading from a hospital protocol. It hadn't mattered. Sterling had seen something shift in the room when she'd adjusted Reeves' pain medication on the morning after admission, had watched the commander's shoulders relax at her touch, had noticed the moment Reeves' wife said, "That nurse knows what she's doing," with the kind of certainty that came from recognizing authority in places others couldn't see it. So Sterling had escalated. The performance improvement plan was just the opening salvo. Laura pulled it from the board, careful, professional, not angry, and photographed it with her phone. Documentation. A habit from another life. She folded the printout and slid it into her bag, then continued to the medication dispensary like nothing had happened. But that wasn't the worst part. Sterling had called in reinforcements. 2 board members appeared on her shift later that morning, Dr. Hayes, whose research Sterling had funded with a personal grant 5 years ago, and Margaret Wu, whose daughter Sterling's wife knew socially. They moved through the unit with the deliberate slowness of people conducting an audit, and Sterling narrated her movements like a nature documentary voiceover. "Note the hesitation," he said as Laura calculated a morphine drip. "Excessive time on basic tasks. Should take 90 seconds. She's taking 3 minutes." The observation was false, the drip required verification, cross-check, documentation, but Laura didn't correct him. Correction was defiance. Defiance was fuel. Hayes took notes. Wu watched with the kind of clinical disinterest that came from having no skin in the game. The real orchestration came at lunch. Laura entered the break room with a container of rice and vegetables, something she could eat in 4 minutes without tasting. The central table held 5 younger nurses, Chen, Ortiz, the 2 Jennifers, and Boyce, whose parking spot she'd once helped him find when his car was broken down in the garage. The moment she sat at the adjacent table, they stood. All of them. In perfect unison, like they'd rehearsed it. "We should eat somewhere without the department fossil," Ortiz said, loud enough that people 3 rooms away could hear it. The word hit like a spar from another war, fossil, relic, something preserved but useless, something that should be excavated carefully and stored in a museum rather than allowed to move freely. They filed out without looking back. Ortiz's cup clattered into the trash. Chen left her yogurt on the table, unopened, as if proximity to Laura had contaminated it. Laura unwrapped her lunch with steady hands. Her knuckles were white, pressed against the container, but her breathing stayed even. In and out. The way she'd learned in Helmand when command made decisions that got people killed. The way she'd learned in extraction zones when the only path forward required every muscle in her body to stop shaking. Muscle memory wasn't just physical. Pain was information. Humiliation was data. She filed it away. The next morning, Sterling maximized the damage. Reeves was scheduled for surgery at 0800, a thoracic reconstruction that might let him regain some mobility in his legs, the kind of procedure that took 8 hours and carried the particular weight of last chance. Laura had reviewed his pre-surgical checklist the evening before, walking him through the protocol, answering the questions his wife didn't ask but should have. He'd held her steady gaze for longer than necessary, and something in his expression said, "I know you." She'd said nothing. Said nothing when his daughters thanked her for being so kind to Dad. Said nothing when his wife squeezed her hand and whispered, "Thank you." At 0630, she was repositioning him for his final pre-op assessment, adjusting the drainage tubes, checking the dressing on his thoracic wound. The respiratory therapist arrived to do a final respiratory assessment before extubation in surgery. Standard protocol. Routine. The kind of procedure that had been done 10,000 times in this unit alone. Except the therapist was new. 3 weeks in. Nervous around chest tubes. She bumped it during tube position verification. Not a collision. A gentle displacement. The kind of thing that happens in hospitals because bodies move and equipment exists in the same space and sometimes they occupy identical coordinates. Reeves' chest tube dislodged. The oxygen saturation monitor began its descent like a countdown timer. 94. 92. 90. Laura was at his bedside in 3 strides, her hands already moving before conscious thought assembled itself into action. Tracheal deviation. Absent breath sounds on the right. The clinical markers assembled themselves into a diagnosis that carried a name, tension pneumothorax. The lung had collapsed. Air was accumulating in his thoracic cavity. If it wasn't released in the next 60 seconds, his heart would begin to fail. Reeves' eyes found hers. There was recognition there, something that cut through the medical crisis like a knife through water. Recognition of what she was. Of what she could do. Of who she'd been when the world still knew her name. Laura moved. The attending physician was 2 floors up. The code team was 90 seconds out. That meant the window was hers. The responsibility was hers. The decision was hers, and she'd made it in an environment far more hostile than an ICU in San Diego, surrounded by people far more dangerous than a man in a wheelchair with a collapsed lung. She prepped the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, with chlorhexidine swabs that came away rust-colored against the pale skin. Her hands were a surgeon's hands, muscle memory from Helmand running the operation like an autopilot system, years of field trauma training taking control because there was no time for hesitation. The 14-gauge angiocath needle slid between the ribs with the kind of fluid precision that came from having done this in darkness, in mud, with rounds coming downrange and the weight of a platoon on her shoulders. The hiss of escaping air filled the room like a held breath finally released. Reeves' oxygen saturation climbed. 86. 91. 94. His lips moved from dusky blue back to pink. His wife was sobbing. His body relaxed. The code team appeared in the doorway, already moving, already assembling, already becoming the cavalry that arrived 3 minutes too late. And Sterling was standing in the doorway, his eyes moving from the needle, to the syringe, to Laura's steady hands, to Reeves' face. His jaw went tight. His eyes went to the charge nurse. "That's practicing medicine without a license," he said, and his voice was very quiet, which was worse than shouting. "Get me the incident report paperwork. Now." Reeves tried to speak. "She saved." "Sir, please rest." Sterling placed a hand on the bed rail, his touch claiming the space, asserting authority. "This is being handled." But Reeves was staring at Laura with the kind of intensity that came from understanding. His eyes tracked her as the code team moved her aside, as medical chaos reorganized itself around the collapsed lung and the necessary protocols. She reached for the patch beneath her jacket, felt it through the linen, and Reeves' gaze followed the motion like he was reading a letter written in gesture. His lips formed words without sound. 2 of them, crisp and clear and carrying the weight of recognition that transcended years and distance and the careful invisibility she'd constructed one shift at a time. "Senior Chief." Sterling's head snapped around. "What did you say?" Reeves closed his eyes, breathing easy now, his oxygen saturation climbing back into safe numbers. But something had shifted in the room, something irreversible, something that made Sterling's hands clench into fists as he stared at the space where Laura had been standing. The code team took Reeves for emergency imaging. Sterling remained in the empty room, staring at the needle, staring at the syringe, staring at the space where a senior ICU nurse had just demonstrated a level of clinical authority that couldn't possibly exist in someone who'd spent 12 years as hospital furniture. What happened next changed everything. The needle slid between Reeves' second and third ribs at 0632 hours, and everything Sterling had spent 3 days constructing began to crack. Laura didn't know it yet. She was running vitals on the post-op floor when the respiratory therapist, a third-year named Marcus, eager and quick but not careful, shifted Reeves' position during his morning repositioning routine. The mattress rotated. The transfer board slid. And the chest tube, secured with only standard adhesive and silk tape after the emergency placement from 2 days prior, caught the rail of the bed frame and dislodged with the sound of a bottle cap popping open. Marcus froze. Laura was 3 patient rooms away, checking labs on a 67-year-old with pneumonia, when the monitor alarm screamed, a sound like a smoke detector wired directly into panic. O2 saturation 94. 91, 88. The sound spiraled downward like a helicopter losing altitude, and everyone in the ICU moved at once, but the attending physician, Dr. Chen, was scrubbing in for a 0700 case. He was already past the point of immediate return, gloved hands raised in sterile position, his voice crackled over the intercom, "Status." Reeves' lung was collapsing. Tension pneumothorax, air trapped in the pleural space with nowhere to go, pressure building against his heart and lungs like a hand pressing on his chest from the inside. His breathing went shallow. His color went gray. The monitor showed a heart rate climbing toward 140, a body trying to compensate for a slow asphyxiation that was happening in real time. Laura was there before the thought finished forming. She didn't run. Running was panic. Instead, she moved through the ICU with a kind of precision that came from having done this before, in places where the power was diesel generators and the lights were infrared, where you had to work inside a man's chest cavity while rounds were still echoing down a canyon in Helmand Province. Muscle memory didn't ask permission. It didn't wait for hierarchy. It moved. "Give me an 18-gauge needle and prep the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line," she said, already unwrapping the equipment with her left hand while her right steadied Reeves' shoulder. Not a request. A command issued in the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Laura, we need to wait for Dr. Chen," Marcus started, but his voice was already fading under the sound of the monitor, under the hiss of oxygen flowing through the wall unit, under the terrible wheeze of a man whose lung was being squeezed by its own air pocket. She didn't acknowledge him. She located the space between ribs, the second and third intercostal space, the anatomical window she could find in the dark, in the rain, with her hand shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion and the weight of keeping people alive when death was 10 seconds away. The needle went in. The plunger depressed. The air escaped with a small, specific hiss, like a tire releasing pressure, like the sound of a crisis reversing itself. O2 saturation climbed. 88, 92, 95, 97. The monitor's screen dropped to a manageable alarm. Reeves' color shifted from gray back toward human. His breathing deepened. The hand of the universe, which had been pressing down on his chest, released. The room went quiet in that particular way that only happens when someone has just been pulled back from the edge. Even the machine seemed to respect the silence. Dr. Chen appeared in the ICU entrance, still scrubbed in, still sterile, his eyes moving from the monitor to Reeves to Laura, who was already documenting the procedure with the same clinical precision she brought to every detail of her work. She wrote down the time, the location, the needle gauge, the patient response. She wrote the facts. She didn't write about muscle memory or about the difference between a protocol that existed in a hospital handbook and a protocol that existed in a part of her spine that had been trained by a military that couldn't officially acknowledge her existence. "What happened?" Dr. Chen asked, and his voice carried the particular tone of someone trying to understand reality. "Chest tube dislodgement during transfer," she said. "Tension pneumothorax. O2 sat dropped to 88. I performed needle decompression at the second intercostal space to relieve pressure while we awaited physician assessment." The words were clinical, precise, stripped of everything except their meaning. She could have been reading a textbook. She could have been delivering news about someone else entirely, someone distant and unimportant, someone who wasn't standing in front of a physician who was trying to understand where that procedure had come from and why Laura Bennett, the quiet nurse who nodded at everyone, who made no waves, who seemed to exist in the background like fluorescent lighting, had moved with the kind of competence that belonged in an operating room with a full surgical team. Reeves watched her. His eyes tracked her movements as she cleaned the needle site, applied pressure with sterile gauze, documented the vital sign changes with the steady hand of someone for whom this was routine. Not remarkable. Just necessary. And something shifted in his expression. Something that looked like recognition, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place, like someone remembering where they'd seen that exact movement before, that precise angle of approach, that muscle memory that didn't hesitate, that competence that had saved him in exactly this kind of moment, in a place where the air was dust and the pressure was real and the hands doing the work belonged to someone whose rank you whispered but never wrote down. Sterling was in his office when his phone rang. The call lasted 90 seconds. By the time the phone touched the cradle, he had already begun building the mechanism that would remove Laura from Mercy General before she could tell anyone else what she actually was. He made his first call at 06 for 5 hours, to board member Thomas Harrison, a cardiologist with financial interests that Sterling had protected during a research grant allocation 3 years prior. "Tom, I need to discuss something delicate. One of our nursing staff performed an advanced procedure on a patient this morning without physician oversight. Needle decompression. Unauthorized. If something had gone wrong, the liability exposure would destroy us. Harrison listened. Harrison understood. Harrison promised to bring it to the Credentials Committee. The second call went to board member Patricia Vance, a hospital administrator with connections to the Joint Commission that Sterling had cultivated carefully over 5 years of research collaboration. The same story. The same framing. The same calculated weight of institutional vulnerability. She would initiate an immediate investigation. The third call was different. Sterling had prepared for this moment before Laura even slid the needle into Reeves' chest. He had already researched the gaps in her employment history, the 7-year void between 2008 and 2015 where Laura Bennett seemed to not exist at all. No tax returns. No employment records. No addresses that led anywhere real. Just disconnected phone numbers and a P.O. box at a naval station that had been decommissioned in 2012. He called a private investigator named Dale Hartley, a man who specialized in credential verification fraud and who owed Sterling a favor from a previous research study that had paid Hartley's firm $85,000 in consulting fees. Dale, I need you to look into someone's background. 7-year employment gap. Missing verifiable references. Possibly fraudulent credentials. The investigator's response was immediate and professional. I'll start tonight. By noon, Sterling had positioned himself in the center of a network of obligation and institutional leverage, each thread connected, each one tightening. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't making threats. He was simply activating a system designed for exactly this scenario, where someone stepped outside their lane and had to be removed before they caused additional damage. The system was elegant. The system was thorough. The system worked. But that wasn't what made Sterling smile as he stared out the window of his office, watching Laura move through the ICU far below him. What made him smile was that she still didn't understand what she'd done. She still thought she'd saved a patient. She didn't realize she'd just handed him the weapon he'd been waiting to use. The cardboard box felt heavier than 12 years of shifts should weigh. Laura's hands moved through her locker on autopilot, stethoscope coiled like a snake, badge clipped to a lanyard she'd worn so carefully it had faded to the color of old bone, compression socks folded into identical rectangles. The break room was empty at 18:47 hours. Good. She couldn't watch anyone's face right now. Her phone buzzed. Washington, D.C. area code. She'd let it ring twice before, watching the voicemail notification accumulate like snow. This time she answered before the second ring finished. Laura Bennett. Her voice sounded like someone else's, a stranger's, thin and careful. Senior Chief Bennett, this is Captain Morrison, JG Corps. The voice was crisp, military precise, the kind of tone that belonged in bunkers and secure rooms. We need to discuss your current situation at Mercy General. Do not speak to anyone until we arrive. Understood. The line went dead. Laura stood motionless, the phone still pressed to her ear. Her hands weren't shaking, that was the training talking, the part of her that had learned to keep her body under absolute control while her mind processed impossible things. But her chest felt like someone had wrapped piano wire around it and pulled tight. J.G. Corps. Judge Advocate General. Military Legal Affairs. Which meant the Pentagon knew. Which meant someone had connected the dots between the needle decompression, the way she'd moved, the muscle memory that had taken over before she could think, and the woman who was supposed to not exist. She finished packing the box in silence. 12 years reduced to cardboard. Her name tag went in last, the plastic scratched from 1,000 hand sanitizer pumps, the photo for years old because she'd never updated it, never drawn attention, never done anything that might trigger a closer look at her credentials from her missing years as Dr. Sterling had so helpfully phrased it to the investigators. The rain started somewhere around 1900 hours. Fat drops that sounded like static against the parking lot, like white noise designed to muffle thinking. Laura found herself driving north instead of south, away from her apartment, toward the coastal highway. The Pacific stretched gray and furious, white caps churning like something alive and angry, and she turned left toward the gates of Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery. The guard waved her through without checking her ID. She parked near the flagpole and walked without a map. Her feet knew the way. 12 years of visits. Every anniversary. Every time Michael deployed. Every time the weight of invisibility threatened to crack through the careful composure. Tom's grave sat in a row of identical white stones, salt wind weathering the letters incrementally, the same way time had worn her down to almost nothing. She knelt in the mud without caring that her scrubs would stain, that her knees would soak through, that the rain was coming sideways now like needles. "I promised you," she whispered. Her voice didn't shake. Even here, even alone, her voice stayed level. "I promised I'd keep my head down. After they erased me, after they said I never existed, I promised I'd stay invisible for Michael's sake. I wouldn't draw attention. I wouldn't risk him. And I couldn't even do that. I couldn't be nobody for 6 months." The rain hammered harder, as if the sky itself was demanding more from her, more penance, more silence. Now Michael's CO might die because I couldn't just be what I'm supposed to be. Just a nurse. Just a woman no one remembers. She pressed the faded patch against her heart, the 75th Ranger Regiment insignia sewn inside her jacket lining, the only proof she'd ever been anyone at all. The stitching was coming loose on one corner. She'd need to fix that. She'd need to fix a lot of things. Or maybe Tom was right, from wherever the dead went, maybe she'd never been able to fix anything except other people's broken bodies while her own soul leaked out in slow increments. Her phone rang at 2011 hours. She watched the call come in, the DC area code lighting up the screen. Then she stood, muddy and soaked, and walked back to the car. Some calls had to be answered in the rain. Some truths were too big for shelter. By the time Laura returned to Mercy General, word had already moved through the hospital like infection spreading through clean tissue. She heard it in the whispers, nurses clustering near the medication station, residents speaking in low urgent tones outside the radiology lab, attending physicians in the physician's lounge where the attending had left the door deliberately open so she could hear them processing the explosion that had detonated in the ER exactly 40 minutes earlier. At 2,200 hours, a gunshot victim had come through the trauma bay doors, GSW to the right shoulder, entry wound maybe 2 centimeters, the kind of wound that would have killed him if it had been 3 inches to the left. The patient was conscious. The patient was combative. The patient was screaming in Pashto while 3 residents held him down and an attending physician ordered restraints and 5 milligrams midazolam for push to sedate him enough to work. Laura had been in the hallway finishing the incident report Sterling had made her file within the hour, the one documenting her unauthorized medical intervention during Reeves' emergency, the one written in language that made a life-saving procedure sound like reckless endangerment, when she passed the trauma bay. Through the reinforced glass, she saw the man's face. Saw the moment his eyes found her. Saw the recognition move through his body like electricity. He'd been struggling against the restraints before. After he saw her, he didn't struggle. He went rigid. Then he started screaming. Malkai Helmand. The Angel of Helmand. The Pashto came in fractured, desperate bursts. The one who killed Khalid with her bare hands. The ghost who saved the American commander. You. Every head in the ER turned toward the glass. Laura felt 30 pairs of eyes land on her in the hallway. The older residents, the ones who'd been in school during her military service, who'd never heard the real stories, only the classified ones that didn't exist, stared like she'd just materialized from some parallel dimension. Secure him. Propofol 100 milligrams for deeper sedation, the attending called out, voice shaking slightly. Someone call security about this patient. And someone, the attending looked toward the hallway, toward Laura, someone get me an explanation. Laura backed away. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. But the rain from the cemetery was still dripping from her jacket, and she could feel it cold against her skin, like a reminder that some truths couldn't stay buried, that some ghosts couldn't stay dead just because the Pentagon had declared them officially non-existent. Dr. Sterling emerged from the elevator like a shark sensing blood in the water. He'd heard the commotion. Everyone in a 4-block radius had probably heard the screaming in Pashto, the accusations of killings and operations, and a woman who shouldn't exist but apparently did, apparently had a code name, apparently was standing in his hallway dripping cemetery mud onto his pristine tile floor. What's happening here? Sterling's voice carried that particular edge that meant he'd already assembled his narrative, already decided what the explanation would be. A resident stammered, the patient recognized Nurse Bennett from Afghanistan. We're not sure what the connection is, but he's... Security, Sterling called out, his voice cutting through the commotion like a scalpel through silk. Escort Ms. Bennett from the building. Now. She's suspended as of this moment. Effective immediately. Laura didn't argue. Didn't explain. Didn't do anything except set her cardboard box down on a nearby chair and walk toward the emergency exit, her scrubs still damp from kneeling at Tom's grave, the 75th Ranger Regiment patch pressed against her heart like a secret that had just stopped being one. But as she reached the exit doors, her phone vibrated in her pocket. A text message, this one not from the JG Corps captain but from an unknown number with a 619 area code. Just 3 words. Stay in the building. The rain had stopped by the time she turned around. The rain had stopped by the time she turned around. Her locker door hung open like a mouth mid-sentence, half empty now, her shift badge still on the shelf next to a photograph of Tom in dress blues, taken the year before the IED found him en route Helmand. The phone in her pocket vibrated once. Then again. The Pentagon's JG Corps doesn't call twice. Laura's hands were steady as she answered. The voice on the other end was clipped, official, a colonel she didn't recognize. Senior Chief Bennett, we need you to remain at Mercy General. Do not leave the building. An asset we've been tracking just arrived at your trauma bay. Your presence is required. The line went dead before she could ask what asset, which made her stomach tighten because she already knew. There were only 3 names that could trigger a Pentagon call in the middle of her suspension. She was still holding the phone when the intercom crackled, trauma activation, Bay 3, gunshot wound to lower abdomen, ETA 2 minutes. Then came the chaos, the organized choreography of emergency medicine, the wheeled stretcher, the flurry of residents and attending physicians moving like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Laura didn't move toward the bay. She couldn't. She was suspended. But she walked to where she could see without being seen, pressed her back against the wall outside observation room, where the monitors displayed vitals like a second language she'd never stopped speaking. The stretcher rounded the corner and her breath caught. The man on it was dark-skinned, muscled, and his eyes were scanning the room with the tactical awareness of someone trained to mark exits and threats. Blood soaked through gauze at his hip. His lips were moving, muttering something in rapid Pashto, and then his gaze locked on the doorway where Laura stood in her civilian clothes, the faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch barely visible where it was sewn inside her jacket lining. The words came like a scream, Malika. Malika E. Helmand. The Angel of Helmand. You killed Khalid with your bare hands in Sanjin. You pulled us from the ambush. His voice cracked into something between a laugh and a sob as the trauma team rushed him deeper into the bay. It's her. It's really her. The one they said was a ghost. The room went dead silent. Every head turned. Residents stared. Nurses froze. The attending physician's pen stopped mid-notation. Dr. Sterling, who'd been supervising from the corner, his face already rigid with rage at the presence of the suspended nurse outside her suspension zone, watched the color drain from his own features as the words hung in the air like blood in saline, the Angel of Helmand. Not a fabricated credential. Not a lie. Something older. Something worse than anything he'd manufactured. Sterling's jaw moved but nothing came out. He looked like a man who'd spent weeks building a case against someone and just discovered he'd been arguing with a legend. The Taliban commander was wheeled into surgery. The attending didn't ask permission, he told Laura to suit up. She didn't hesitate. She changed into scrubs, moved to the surgical observation gallery, and for the first time in 72 hours, she stood where she belonged, watching over a patient with the eye of someone who'd done this in dust and darkness and the kind of chaos that had no anesthesia. 12 hours later, Michael burst through the unit doors like a man who'd been running since he got the call. Full dress uniform, shoulders back, his voice cracking as he found her in the hallway. "Mom, Commander Reeves told me everything. He recognized the way you moved when you did that needle decompression. Said only a senior chief could have executed it that way. He's been waiting for this moment since Helmand." His eyes were bright, wet, looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "He said you pulled his whole platoon out of an ambush. That you weren't on any official roster, that you were supposed to be a myth, and that you saved his life twice now." The words hit her like ordnance. Twice. Once in that dusty valley in 2009 when the insurgent rounds came from 3 angles and she'd calculated the trajectories in her head and dragged 23 Marines out of the kill zone. Once 3 days ago with a needle and the knowledge that bodies were predictable when you understood their pressure dynamics. "We need to show you something." Michael's hand was warm on her shoulder, and he guided her to the break room where Commander Reeves sat in his wheelchair, a leather-bound journal on his lap, his hands trembling as he held it out. The handwriting was precise, military issue. "Senior Chief Bennett extracted my entire Charlie platoon from an ambush in Sanjin Valley, 2009. 12 Marines in a crossfire, no cover, incoming from grid reference," the words went on. Details. Names. Coordinates. A factual record of a woman who wasn't supposed to exist saving lives that were never officially saved because the operation that deployed her had never officially happened. Then came the knock on the break room door. 2 men in dark suits, FBI credentials on their belts, their presence carrying the weight of federal authority like a second atmosphere. They didn't look at Laura. They walked past her like she was a ghost, and she realized that's what they'd been briefed to do: ignore her, find Sterling, and what came next happened fast enough that she had to piece it together from the shock on everyone's faces. Dr. Richard Sterling. The first agent's voice was flat, procedural. "During our investigation into Ms. Bennett's credentials, you attempted to forge documentation suggesting discrepancies in her nursing license application. You also accessed sealed military records through fraudulent means, claiming to be conducting official hospital business." Sterling had been standing near the medication cart, and his hand went out for support that wasn't there. The color drained from his face like water from a bath. "I was protecting this institution," he started, and the second agent cut him off. "We've also been investigating your research grant applications. Multiple instances of fabricated data, misappropriated funds, and falsified institutional review board approvals. The amount we're talking about is $847,000 in fraudulent federal grants." The number hung in the air like accusation made concrete. Sterling's voice rose, desperate now. She performed procedures outside her scope. She endangered a patient. But a SEAL team leader stepped forward from where he'd been waiting by the wall, silver beard, tattoo of a trident on his wrist, the bearing of a man who'd seen actual combat. 2 silver stars. His voice was quiet, respectful, the kind of respect that was earned in places most people never went. He looked directly at Sterling. "One for the Sanjin operation. One for an extraction that's classified at the highest level. There was also a Navy Cross recommended for Valor, but it never made it through because the entire operation doesn't exist in the official record. Senior Chief Bennett's service record is cleaner than yours will ever be, Doctor." The FBI agents produced handcuffs. Sterling's protests escalated into something like hysteria. "You can't do this here, not in front of," but they cuffed him anyway, the metal snapping shut with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. His white coat twisted from the restraints, his perfectly styled hair disheveled, his face the color of old meat. The walk to the exit took maybe 20 seconds, but every second was captured on a dozen phones, every angle recorded, every moment of his fall broadcast to the staff who stood frozen in the hallway. A resident he'd mentored turned away, unable to watch. A nurse whispered something that sounded like he called her a fossil. And as the agents walked him past Laura, Sterling hissed, his voice raw with something between rage and revelation, "You ruined me." Laura took one measured breath. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and clinical, indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath them. She wiped a single tear from her cheek, not from sadness, but from something older, something that had been waiting 12 years to be released. Her eyes met his and her voice came out quiet, clear, the voice of someone who'd already survived worse than any man in a white coat could inflict. "No, Doctor. You did that yourself the moment you mistook invisibility for weakness." The automatic doors closed behind him with a hydraulic sigh. The lobby felt different after he left. Lighter. Light pressure had been released from the room. Commander Reeves' surgery proceeded that afternoon, Laura observing from the gallery as the attending surgeon, a smart woman who understood hierarchy when she saw it, positioned the microscope for spinal decompression. The operation unfolded like music, precise, purposeful, every movement designed to relieve the compression that had stolen Reeves' legs. Laura watched the surgical field come into focus, watched the attending carefully separate tissue, watched the pressure finally ease from the nerve root. 6 months later, Laura stood in dress blues for the first time in a decade. The uniform hung on her like memory-made cloth, and the decorations on her chest caught the light, 2 silver stars positioned over her heart, their ribbons the color of courage. Beside her stood Commander Reeves in his own dress blues, leg braces visible but functional, his body learning to carry weight again through sheer force of will. The Navy Medical Center San Diego's auditorium held 200 people. Michael was in the second row, his own uniform spotless, his face the expression of a man watching his mother reclaim what had been taken. The hospital administrator stood at the podium and read the citation, for extraordinary service both in theater and at home, for maintaining the highest standards of care under impossible circumstances, and for demonstrating that true leadership requires no rank or recognition. Laura Bennett is appointed Director of Trauma Services, Navy Medical Center San Diego, effective immediately. The applause came like a wave. Commander Reeves' wife found Laura afterward, tears in her eyes, "Thank you for saving him." Both times. Laura's response was quiet, matter-of-fact, the voice of someone who'd never expected gratitude for doing what was necessary. "He's my son's commanding officer. I couldn't do anything else." Michael texted her a photograph that night. Dr. Sterling behind a folding table in a strip mall office park, his business card stacked beside a desktop bell, Sterling Insurance Services, printed in cheap blue ink. The white coat was gone. The institutional prestige had evaporated like morning dew. What remained was a man selling life insurance from a folding table, his empire reduced to walk-in customers and commission splits, his legacy a federal conviction and a YouTube video that had been viewed 3.2 million times. Laura studied the photograph for a long moment, then texted back a single line, "Everything comes due eventually." She visited Tom's grave 3 days later. The San Diego sun had turned the Pacific beyond the cemetery into something that looked like liquid gold, and when she knelt by the headstone, she placed her director's credentials beside the photograph of Tom in dress blues. "I kept my promise as long as I could," she said to the stone, to the man buried beneath it, to the 18 years of invisibility she'd finally shed. But staying invisible meant letting people suffer. "And you didn't raise me to do that." Michael appeared from between the white headstones, putting a hand on her shoulder. They walked together through Fort Rosecrans, past rows of markers that represented decades of service, sacrifice, the invisible cost of freedom that most people never had to pay. Laura's uniform was bright in the afternoon light, and somewhere behind them, she could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors, the sound of the military machine continuing its work, continuing to move forward, continuing to demand people willing to act when others froze. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who serve silently, the ones who walk among us with the kind of strength that requires no announcement. Like this video if you believe that true heroism isn't about recognition, it's about doing what's right when everyone's watching and doing it anyway when no one is. Comment below, if you had Laura's skills and Laura's secret, what would you have done differently? Would you have stayed invisible, or would you have acted sooner? And follow the channel because next week, we're telling the story of a woman who was declared legally dead until she walked into the courtroom where the man who killed her was on trial.